Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the video for Lab 2 on DNS in Server 2003. In this video, we're going to pick up really right from where we left off in the first lab, and what we're going to focus on predominantly in this video is Server 2. Okay, and in Server 1 and Lab 1, we really set up DNS on this server. We set it up as a primary standard zone. In this lab, we're going to focus on zone transfers and getting that information from Server 1 over to Server 2. Okay, and to do this, we're going to have to set up a standard secondary zone. Now, we're also going to work with XP1, and we'll set this up so it's a Server 1 is a preferred DNS server, and Server 2 is the secondary DNS server. Let's take a look at some of the other things we'll cover. We're going to start off covering dynamic DNS on Server 2. And I want to show you a couple things related to the primary DNS suffix, as I said I would in the first lab. Then we're going to go through and install DNS on Server 2. Set up a forward and reverse lookup zone, except this time they're going to be secondaries as we see here. We'll go through and we'll take a look at the zone transfer settings. Okay, so a closer look at these settings, some of the other zone settings. Then we'll go through, configure the DNS client, and then lastly we're going to focus on DNS recovery. What we do if our DNS server fails or we need to transfer that database over to a different system. Okay, let's get started by connecting over to Server 2. So we're going to form a remote desktop connection over to Server 2. And what we're really going to focus on as a starting point is that primary DNS suffix setting. Okay, so it looks like we're having a hard time connecting over to Server 2 for some reason. Okay, so what we'll do instead, we're doing some fiddling around here. We'll use an IP address for right now, and we'll investigate once we get over there. Okay, so and that's a perfect example of what I talked about in Lab 1, where sometimes your name resolution issues don't work, but the IP address does work. And when that happens, then we definitely have a name resolution issue, and that's something that we'll, like I said, take a look at and try to address right now. All right, first things first, let's take a look at the IP settings. And this machine currently right now is set up with an IP address of 192.168.1.200, that same 24-bit subnet mask and default gateway that we saw on Server 1 and also the XP machine. Its preferred DNS server has been changed. It was pointing out to a public DNS server previously. Well, now it's been changed to point to our local DNS server like you would always want to do when you set up DNS on your company network. Okay, so these settings all look good. Now let's go take a look at the primary DNS suffix, something that we focused on a little bit in Lab 1. And we see that by going to the computer name setting here. Okay, and by the way, I right-clicked my computer. That's what this icon is here. I've just renamed it to Server 2. So right-click, Properties, Computer Name, and we see that it's Server 2 dot, and we've got blank entry there. It's not .wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, and that's that primary DNS suffix setting that we see right here. As you see, it's not filled in. Now, something we should qualify this with, this isn't always something that you'll have to worry about. In a situation where this machine is a domain controller or a member server of a domain, this setting will not have to be set by you. It'll actually already be set when you join the domain or install, Active Directory on that machine. So if I were to specify that I wanted my Active Directory domain name to be wiredbraincoffee.com, that would be populated in this primary DNS suffix, so I wouldn't have to worry about it. Okay? And then another example, another situation where you don't have to worry about this, is in a small office environment or your home network. If you're in a situation where, let's just say that you've got a system at home that needs to connect out to the internet, and you're not using DNS locally on your local network, then you don't have any reason to worry about this primary DNS suffix setting as well. Okay, if you take a look at your home system that's not part of a network, it's probably not going to have a primary DNS suffix setting here, and you can connect out to the internet fine. And the reason this works, well, you just really don't need to use DNS in a local fashion whatsoever. Let's go run a couple commands here, and I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean and some of the problems it can cause. So we've gone to a command prompt. We're going to run nslookup here. When I run nslookup, you see that it does resolve and it finds our default server, Server 1. If I type in XP1, so in this case I'm just trying to get a simple name resolution on a computer named XP1, it fails on the network and it tells me that it can't find XP1. Okay, and the reason it is, Well, it's not attaching this .wiredbraincoffee.com because that's not part of server 2's primary DNS suffix. So if I want a resolution XP1, I'll literally have to type out the complete fully qualified domain name as you see here, okay, xp1.wiredbraincoffee.com. Now when I do this, I do get a name resolution down to an IP address, okay, and then we'd be able to connect or get the necessary information that we needed. Okay. Another issue when we try to install DNS and we try to do zone transfers, we're going to run into all sorts of problems because this machine is not part of that zone. Okay, let's go ahead and change that setting now, and when we reboot and come back up again, we'll take a look at how this changes and how things are different here now on server 2. Okay, so remember what we have here. We're not really able to resolve names without that primary DNS suffix without typing out the fully qualified domain name. So to change this, just like we did before, it's right-click, Properties, Computer Name, Change, click on More, and then type in whatever you want to use as your primary DNS suffix. Okay, make sure that's spelled correctly to avoid multiple reboots, and then click OK 4 different times here. Make sure you click OK all the way out, and then reboot your system. So I'm going to click Yes here, and that'll close down our remote connection on the server, and we're back to the XP1 client machine here. We're going to be waiting for this machine to reboot. So in the meantime, I'm going to stop this video, and we'll start it right back up again once server 1 has rebooted, or I'm sorry, server 2 has rebooted. Okay, server 2 has rebooted. It's up and running, so we're going to connect back over to it using the IP address 192.168.1.200 once again. Okay, and then once we're here, we're going to take a close look. One thing we didn't pay particularly close attention to before were dynamic DNS updates. Okay, and one thing that we should have pointed out, and I'll point out now, is that when you try to do a dynamic update without that primary DNS suffix set correctly like we just did, it's not going to work. Okay, so now that we've set that DNS suffix, and I'll demonstrate that by going to the properties here, you see now that when we look at the computer name, it's now server2.wiredbraincoffee.com, and dynamic updates will work. There won't be any problems with them. It's before that, when we get rid of this, okay, when it was just server 2 before, dynamic updates are not going to work within the DNS zone. Okay, so you will run into problems there. And now let's take a look too. When we run nslookup, okay, we still resolve over to server 1 like we did before, but look what happens now. We can just type in XP1 and it appends our primary DNS suffix to it, wiredbraincoffee.com, and our name resolution process is much, much simpler. Okay, now if we're connecting over to some other zone that's not our primary DNS suffix, we will have to append that DNS suffix. And a good example would be, let's say we're trying to connect out to a internet fully qualified domain name such as Microsoft.com. Okay, notice I have to type out www.microsoft.com. If I just type www, it's going to add the .wiredbraincoffee.com suffix to it. Okay, so when I type this, I do get an answer here. Here I see all the different web servers, or IP addresses anyway, that map out to Microsoft's web servers. Just typing in www doesn't get me anything. Okay, you can see we get an error message down here. Okay, so that's not going to work. So we can exit out of here now, okay, and feel pretty good about that working appropriately. Now regarding that dynamic DNS setting I was talking about before, we will take a look at this just momentarily. And to do this, what we'll do is we'll just switch the IP address up on this server here. Okay, I'm going to right click, go to Properties of My Network Places, and we'll just change this IP address here to 201. Okay, and then click OK here a couple times. Now we will be disconnected because we have a remote desktop connection over to .200, and all of a sudden we've switched over to .201. So you see the hourglass here that indicates basically that this is not connected right now. Okay, and we're sitting around here and we see right here that the connection attempt has been lost, attempting to reconnect your session. Well, we're not going to sit around for all 20 attempts. This is something we expected. So we'll just go ahead and cancel this. It takes us back here to the desktop again. And what we can do now, if we wanted to connect out to server 2, we could, of course, do that by just connecting to .201. Instead, what we'll do, let's go over to server 1. Okay, we'll connect over, and we're going to take a look at the DNS zone setting there. Okay, so we'll go up here to our DNS console. This is just a shortcut to it, by the way, because we've utilized it so many times. And we'll open up the forward lookup zone for wiredbraincoffee.com, and right here you see we have an entry for server 2, and the IP address has indeed been changed to 1.201. Okay, and the reverse lookup zone setting may or may not have been changed. It has not, and the reason, should have known this because we didn't change it, is previously in Lab 1 we didn't change this to dynamic. Okay, right now this is set at none. If we had changed this to a dynamic update as well, this would have been dynamically updated here as well. So now, to make this still accurate, we'd have to go in here and literally change this IP address here. Okay, and if you look here, this isn't even something I can do. I have to cancel this out completely, delete this record, and recreate it if I want to keep my reverse lookup zone accurate here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that so we're just on the same page. Okay, no big deal here. This is really kind of off the subject, but just to give you a feeling nonetheless. Okay, so we're done with DNS here, but what we're going to do, now we're back to the desktop again here in XP1, and we're going to connect back over to server 2, and we're going to set that IP address back. I don't want to leave it there because that's not how we have it configured from the beginning. So to do so, we're connecting over to 1.201, and once we log on here, we're just pretty much going to reverse the process we just did here a second ago. So we're going down to the properties of this connection. Okay, TCP/IP properties, and we're setting this back to 1.200. Okay, and we're going to experience the exact same remote desktop connection failure here. See the hourglass here once again. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so we don't have to sit through it. And now we're going to connect back over to server 1. Okay, so that's what I just did here. We're going to open up DNS once again. Okay, and I look here and server 2 is still registered as .201. However, I'm going to reload this zone, which basically means purge this information and reload it from the zone database file, and you can see it's already updated itself to .200. Okay, and if we look at our reverse lookup zone, remember before we had to do this manually. Hopefully now it's set up to do it dynamically. We reload this zone, and we get the exact same thing. It's now been changed to 200. Okay, now this record did not change, okay, however, because I guess before we put it in manually, so it kept that static entry. So this is no longer a valid record, and this is something we definitely want to get rid of to avoid any sort of troubleshooting problems. Okay, so right now we have an up-to-date forward and reverse lookup zone for wiredbraincoffee.com. Let's go ahead and close this to avoid any confusion. We're going to close out server 1. And that takes us back down to our recording system, the XP system. And now we're going to focus, like we mentioned before, on server 2. Okay, so we've kind of gone through DDNS on server 2. We're going to install DNS, and we're going to go through the process of these secondary forward and reverse lookup zones. That'll be the next thing we do right now. So let's go ahead and minimize here. Okay, we'll close that, and let's reopen. And we can even use the name server 2. Make things a little bit simpler here. Okay, how do we install DNS? Well, we could do it one of the two ways we discussed before, but in those circumstances, and when I say discussed before, and previously in Lab 1, we talked about 3 different ways we could install DNS, one being through the DC Promo Active Directory installation process, and that definitely wouldn't be appropriate for what we're doing right now. A second way would be to go up here to the Manage Your Server, okay, and if you didn't see this in Lab 1, we'll just repeat it briefly here. This is a way of adding roles to your server in an automated fashion. Okay, when I click Add or Remove a role here, what it does basically, it goes through, it kind of checks out my system, detects the local area connection setting, takes a look at the network as a whole, and it's going to give me a feel for what's currently installed in this system and what we have available to actually install on this system. Now, this isn't something that I want to do, especially in this case, because we're not really going through a typical automated installation type. We're going to create a secondary zone, and we got to specify some unique information. Okay. However, if you wanted to use this, and this is the first DNS server that you were setting up, you could select DNS server as your role here. and it kind of gives you some specs on what to expect. And you just go through and click Next, Next, Finish, and it's going to install DNS and give you some basic settings. We're going to go ahead and do it manually because, as I said in Lab 1, this is something you need to know how to do. Okay, so we go to Add or Remove Programs, Add Remove Windows Components, and you know this part's easy. It's just really the manual process of getting a feel for how to configure each and every different component is what's important. Okay, Add Remove Windows Components. This will pull up here, you know, very similar to what Windows 2000 looked like here in a second. Different options that we can install. Okay, and we're going to go down to Networking Services, go to the Details or double click it, and just make sure you don't select the whole box, and select DNS. That's the one thing we need right now. We'll click OK and then click Next. Now it's going to be looking for some files off of the CD-ROM, so this is something that you'll have to have present, and we're going to see here in a second it's going to stop this installation of DNS here on me, and it's going to ask for those files. And when it does do that, we're going to stop this video. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video just momentarily, let DNS finish up, and we'll take off from there as soon as DNS is installed. Okay, DNS has finished installing, so we can go ahead and close out this window here, and we'll continue on with the process of setting up these secondary zones. Okay, so we're still sitting on server 2 here, and now what we're going to do is just connect, well, we're still sitting on server 2, we're going to connect over to the DNS console. So we're going to go to All Programs, Administrative Tools, and then DNS. Okay, we'll open up DNS here, and as we saw in the previous lab in server 1, we don't start off with any forward or reverse lookup zones. This is going to be something that we're going to have to configure from scratch, basically. So, forward lookup zone. We're going to go through this process here, and we're going to click New Zone, and this takes us to the New Zone wizard. And now here's where we have our first change. Remember, a primary zone is when you first create a DNS database. There can only be one primary DNS, a primary zone, and that primary zone is a read-write copy of the DNS database. Okay, if you want to have any sort of fault tolerance, however, you need to have more copies of your DNS database, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to set up a secondary zone, which is going to copy from server 1 all of those records over here to our secondary zone. Okay, so let's go ahead and walk this. And remember, stub zone we won't talk about yet. That'll be a Lab 3 topic. Okay, so here we choose secondary zone. Click Next. And now we need to specify the zone name. And you got to be careful. You got to make sure that it's exactly the same zone name as we used previously on server 1. Okay, so I've got wiredbraincoffee.com. I click Next. Okay, specify the DNS server from which you want to copy the zone. Servers are contacted in the order shown. Okay, so this is my master DNS server essentially, and that's, you know, exactly what it says here. Where do we want to copy this zone from? Well, server 1's IP address is 192.168.1.100. So I click Add, click Next. Hey, and that's it. Okay, I click Finish now, and when we take a look at this zone here, we see that it's a secondary up here when we're looking at it. Status is that it's running, but right now it tells us that the zone is not loaded by the DNS server. Okay, the DNS server encountered a problem while attempting to load the zone. This is basically just a timing issue, and it's something that you just have to fiddle around with here until you actually get the data. We could reload the zone. A lot of times that'll work just by doing that. Transfer from master, reload from master. Even if you open and close this console, sometimes you'll get the data to pop up here. Okay, so I'm just clicking refresh. That's probably the least of all evils. Let's do a reload from master, see if that works. Nope. Okay, let's close it. Open it up again. Okay, and we still haven't picked this up. So another thing we can do, let's do a restart of this actual service. Okay, so we can stop the server and then restart the server, or just do restart and take care of them both at the same time. Okay, still not getting it. Okay, so it's telling us right here, correct the problem, then either press F5 or the action menu, click refresh. So we're still not getting this actual loaded here. So we could have another issue. Let's take a look though and see. Let's go ahead and close this one more time. Give it a second and open it back up here again. Okay, still running into a problem. Now, however, we do have this exclamation point here. We may get some information. Let's take a look at our event viewer and see what it has to tell us. Okay, here we see that we have an error message, two different error messages, one at 2:59. Let's read this one first and see if it helps out. Okay, a zone transfer request for the secondary zone wired brain coffee was refused by the master DNS server. Okay, but that's helpful. At least we can go check out why that is. Check the zone at master 192.168.1.100 to verify that the zone transfer is enabled to this server. Okay, so that's something that's very helpful. Now let's go take a look at server 1. So we're going to go back over to our client here, and we'll form a remote desktop connection over to server 1. Okay, 192.168.1.100, or we could have just typed in server 1. Either will do. Okay, so we're connected over to server 1. We'll open up the DNS tool here. Okay, and let's take a look at our setting for the forward lookup zone wiredbraincoffee.com. If I go to the properties of this and then take a look at zone transfers, okay, take a look at what it says here. Allow zone transfers, but only to servers listed on the name servers tab. Okay, and if I look at my name servers tab, the only server I see here is server 1. So that's why this zone transfer got refused. Okay, and this is a security setting that's been put in place in Server 2003. Normally, in 2000, your default setting, okay, going back here to zone transfers, was to any server, which, especially in a public environment, is very, very insecure. Okay, it's not something, or unsecure. It's not something that you want to leave set up that way. So what are we going to do here? Well, if we want to test it out, we can put to any server. Well, let's keep this setting secure right now. So we'll come over here to name server, and we're going to add this server right here. Okay, so to do this, what we basically have to do is find the server name. And we can either browse for it or type it in. Browsing for it is just going to take us through the forward lookup zone on server 1. Okay, so if I open this up, let's go back up here again just to make sure you got this. Server 1, this is the DNS server. Here it says forward lookup zones. We're browsing through the forward lookup zones for a host record. Here's the wiredbraincoffee.com standard primary zone. And then here are the host records on server 1 within the wiredbraincoffee.com zone. So I choose server 2. This is the name server we're trying to add. And it puts in our FQDN, fully qualified domain name, and it adds the IP address down here below. So then when I click OK, it adds this name over here to our name servers tab now. And since our zone transfer setting is to allow zone transfers, but only to servers listed in the name servers tab, seems like it should work now. So let's go ahead and try this out. I click OK here, accepting that setting. And now I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. So we're leaving server 1. And now we're going to connect back over again. And we're on XP1 right now. We're going to connect back over again to server 2, which is still open here down here in the taskbar. Now, we're going to reinitiate this process. And to do so, we're going to right-click and try a transfer from master. Okay, and there you go. Just like that, we now have transferred over all of these settings here. Okay, there are the host records, server 1, server 2, and XP1. We have a read-only copy of these records. Okay, how do I know this? Well, if I right-click here, there's no delete button. I can look at the properties, but all this information is grayed out. It's read-only. Same thing with the zone. If I want to right-click on this zone, I can delete this zone, but it's not going to delete the actual copy. Everything else will still be there on the master, on the standard primary. Okay, so not too difficult. Now, one thing we didn't do though, the reverse lookup zone, when we set this up, this still is not going to work. Okay, because we didn't change this over on server 1. So let's go back and set that up before we go ahead and create the next reverse lookup zone. So here we are. We're sitting on server 1 again. And now what we're going to do is basically do the same thing we did up here. Right-click on the actual zone name, go to the properties, and then we're going to go over to the name servers tab and add this entry for server 2 here as a valid server to send zone transfers to. So I add server 2, click OK. Zone transfers, we already have the appropriate setting. We don't need to change this at all. Only to the servers listed in this tab. Click OK here. Okay, and as far as server 1 is concerned, we're all set. Now I'm going to go back down here. We're going to connect back over to server 2 again. Okay, and now we can set up our reverse lookup zone on server 2. So let's see if we pull this off without a hitch now. New zone, secondary zone, because we're not creating a brand new one, we're copying over the one that we already have in place. Make sure we specify the exact same network ID. Who's our master? Okay, 192.168.1.100. Okay, and that's it. Click Finish here. Okay, and this one happened without a hitch. Okay, you see the records copied over right away. So now we've got a fully populated secondary forward lookup zone for wiredbraincoffee.com and also a secondary reverse lookup zone, this one for 192.168.1.x. Okay, so fairly straightforward once you kind of get the hang of what's going on here. Okay, and just keep in mind, when we look here, just to give you a feel for what's going on, I cannot create new records over here. Remember, this is server 2, and this is where our secondary zones are held. So I can't create a new host record here. Nothing's going to happen. All that I can do is reload from master or transfer settings from master. Okay, there's no way for me to add new records on server 2. If we connect over to server 1, though, let's go ahead and add a couple new records here. I'm going to add a new host record for server 3. Okay, and this computer doesn't exist right now in this scenario, but we can still add this record and just get a feel for the process, what goes on here. So I click Add Host, tells me it was successful, so I click OK, and now I'm done. I see that server 3 exists here. Did not populate my entry here, though, unless maybe it will if I reload it. There we go. Okay, and now let's go back over to server 2, or on server 1 right now. Let's check out server 2 and see if these entries have transferred over. Okay, so here we are. Let's try refreshing. Okay, and there you see server 3, this record has actually already been transferred over from the master. And we'll try the same thing here in the reverse lookup zone as well, and we see that the server 3 record has now been transferred over. So zone transfers are working back and forth between server 1 and server 2. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Okay, let's quit going back and forth between these servers. We're going to simplify a little bit here. Let's go ahead and close this. Okay, and I'm going to close this connection to server 2. And we're going to connect back over to server 1. And now what we're going to do, so we can make this easier, is manage our two different DNS servers from one console. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to go ahead and right-click up here on this DNS entry and click Connect to DNS Server. And I don't want to connect to this computer. I want to connect to server 2. Okay, I click OK, and look what we have right here now. We can either manage server 1 or server 2. They're both listed here. And even though I'm sitting on server 1, I'm able to see the entries on server 2 as well. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're looking here. Don't get confused, but here, we have server 1. Here's the forward lookup zone and reverse lookup zones for server 1. And then down below, we have our forward lookup zones and reverse lookup zones for server 2. What we're going to focus on are a couple settings now. We're going to come back up here on server 1, and we're going to right-click wiredbraincoffee.com, the zone, and we're going to go to Properties. Okay, and we're going to take a closer look first at our zone transfer settings, since that's what we're currently working with. Okay, now we just talked about what this means here. Let's take a look at these other settings and see what else we can do with our zone transfer settings. Okay, a zone transfer sends a copy of the zone to requesting servers. We kind of knew that already. We want to allow zone transfers unless, of course, you only have one DNS server, and then maybe you could disable this altogether because you don't want zone transfers occurring at all. Okay? To any server is not a secure setting. Okay, if you are doing this, you might do this in a troubleshooting environment. Maybe for some reason these bottom two options are not working. You can't get your zone transfers to work. Maybe you try this to any server option for a little bit, just to eliminate the fact that maybe it's some other setting. If it works when you have this setting enabled, then it pretty much tells you that you're not doing something right, with one of these bottom two settings. Okay, long story short, this is not a very popular option, not something you'd be doing very often, if at all. Okay, only to servers listed on the Name Servers tab. Makes a lot of sense, lets you control exactly who you're dealing with, and it's working with existing host records already within your zones. Or only to the following servers. Okay, here's a more manual way of doing this, but we could accomplish the same thing that we accomplished with this right here, just by entering the IP addresses of any server that we can allow zone transfers to. Okay, and this is still secure, provided you don't put a bunch of different servers here that you're not really sure about, which is not very likely. We're going to leave our setting here as is, and we're going to talk about this notify option here. Okay, notify. To automatically notify secondary servers when the zone changes, select the automatically notify checkbox and then specify the servers. Okay, now this is one reason why those entries came across almost instantaneously before. Remember when we added server 3 and it came across right away? That's because this automatically notify option is selected here. Okay, and if you look right down below, who should we notify? The servers listed on the name servers tab. So what ends up happening here, let's cancel here for a second. This server, server 1, is going to notify server 2 that, hey, we've just changed the zone here. We've incremented what's called the SOA record. You may want to come up here and transfer over the most current settings. Okay, and then server 1 does not send these records here. It's now up to server 2 to visit server 1 and pull this information over. Okay, now this sounds like a great thing, and for the most part, no problem with it. However, if you have this on and these notifications are constantly occurring and changes are constantly being passed back and forth across the network, we're running into a potential bandwidth problem. So that might be a good reason to turn these automatically notify settings to off. Okay, maybe you have a DNS server on either side of a low-speed WAN connection. Okay, I've got an office here in Seattle, and then we're going to be doing a scenario next where we've got another office in Spokane. Okay, and then what if we have those offices connected by a 64K modem line or a 128K ISDN line, really slow? We're already utilizing this traffic almost up to its full potential. We don't really want to waste any more space or bandwidth by sending off notifications and then DNS records across that bandwidth. Okay, we'll leave this as is for right now, so just cancel. Okay, and pretty much set then with the zone transfers option. Now let's go ahead and go through each of these different tabs here. Okay, we're still on server 1, but let's start off with our general tab. Okay, and here we just have the current status of the DNS server, this particular zone actually, and the status is running. If I want to pause this zone, pretty simple to pause it, and now what's going to happen, if any requests are made to this zone, hey, we're not going to fulfill them. This zone is not operational right now, so I have to click Start to get it up and running again. The type of zone can be changed. Okay, right now we don't have the option of storing it in Active Directory because this machine is not a domain controller. We can change it to a secondary zone, however that would not be a good thing. If we change this primary zone to a secondary, well then we're going to have two secondary copies and no way of adding or changing entries on this machine. Because remember, primaries are read-write, secondaries are read-only. Okay, and then coming down here we have the zone file name. We want to leave that alone. Dynamic updates, this is something that you want to take a look at right away. In most cases, on a private network, I would say yes, use dynamic updates. On a public network, in most cases, I would say no, do not use dynamic updates. Okay, dynamic updates will save you a ton of time on a local network, not so much time, well, would save you time, but there's not really that many entries to be made on a public network, and it's a huge security breach as well, so it's not something that you really want to be doing. Now, once you do this, you also want to make sure that you make the same setting in your reverse lookup zone here. Okay, so remember that even though you make this dynamic, it does not make your reverse lookup zone dynamic as well. So that's something that you need to pay attention to. Okay, aging. Aging controls how long records actually stay within the DNS zone database. So this setting here actually is just one of the settings. Let's take a couple steps back. Aging can actually be set at a server level first, and technically scavenging and aging are set together. We see it right here. Okay, or we can go to the tab up here if we go to properties. So if I go to advanced here, down below I've got enable automatic scavenging of stale records. This needs to be turned on first if I want to enable scavenging. Let's talk about what it is though for a second. If you look at our forward lookup zone here for wiredbraincoffee.com, we get several entries within here. let's assume here for a second that a server 4 registers, and then we take server 4 offline. We decided not to use that record. Server 4 would leave its record, though, within the DNS database, even though server 4 might not be online any longer. And what will happen over time, your DNS database becomes congested with all these entries that are no longer valid. Okay, so scavenging is the act of finding out which one of these entries are invalid and then deleting them from the DNS database and just making it a more efficient database. Okay, and there's several ways we can go about setting this. First way, like I said, would be to set it at a server level. Okay, and to enable it, I need to go to our properties, go over here to advanced, and then turn on enable automatic scavenging of stale records. Okay, and if you see right here, it's set automatically for 7 days. That's the default. We can change this to hours, and we can control the number of days it'll take before it actually scavenges. Okay, from here, next we can go through, and on a zone-by-zone basis, we can actually set scavenging settings. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the properties of the wiredbraincoffee.com zone, and we're going to go back over to where we were before, which is right here under aging. Okay, now scavenging was already turned on. Here, I can turn it on an individual zone-by-zone basis if I indeed wanted to use it here. So we don't necessarily have to do this. It was already turned on the DNS server itself. Okay, let's talk about these settings, however, though. We have a no refresh interval. If this controls how long it is before a DNS client can re-register itself with the DNS database. Okay, and our default number here is 7 days. Okay, 7 days. So if we want this to happen less often, we can of course set this to more days. If we want it to happen more often, we can set it to a lesser setting as well. Okay, so, and just to give you more clarity on what this does, if a DNS client wanted to re-register itself every day, this setting basically will not allow it to re-register itself. Okay, the only way this would work is if you were to delete that record and then run the ipconfig register DNS command that we showed before, then you'd re-register. But otherwise, it's going to prevent clients from re-registering themselves, repopulating themselves within the DNS database. Okay, and the main reason that we want to prevent them from registering every day is because it'll make a change to the actual DNS database, which can affect replication schedules, not only in DNS, but also in Active Directory. It's a bandwidth issue. That's what it boils down to. Next, we have our refresh interval. Okay, and if you read here, this is the time between the earliest moment when a record timestamp can be refreshed and the earliest moment when the record can be scavenged. Okay, so let's assume that a record is in our DNS database and it has not been refreshed for a certain period of time. Let's say that it's been 7 days now. If that record has not been refreshed, it becomes stale. Okay, and then after 7 days, this is when it truly becomes stale, and that's when it's eligible to be scavenged, or in other words, deleted. Okay, so to figure out how long it's going to take before a record is actually deleted from the DNS database, what we need to do is add up these two numbers. And after 14 days, okay, then what will happen is a record will become eligible to be scavenged according to the settings we have configured right here. Okay, so add these numbers up, and that's basically giving you the amount of time before that record is eligible to be scavenged. Okay, and I say eligible because we have one more setting to configure, or to consider, because we already configured it really, and that would be that setting that we set up here at the server level. Okay, remember the setting here, the scavenging setting, it's only going to go through and scavenge every 7 days. So after that 14-day time period has elapsed on the record, then whenever that scavenging happens, so really it's a maximum of 21 days if you added up all three numbers. Okay, and it really depends upon the time schedule after the record has elapsed. Okay, now the default setting is to have scavenging off, which really isn't a big deal. You'll probably be fine without changing anything. So it's not something that you need to pay a lot of attention to, whether you use it or you don't use it. Don't mess around too much with the settings. The defaults are pretty much good as they are. Let's go back into the zone and take a look at some more of the settings we have in here. Okay, so we've looked at the General tab, we've looked at the Name Servers tab, we've looked at the Zone Transfers tab, we have the Start of Authority tab to consider now, and then the Wins tab. The Start of Authority tab is a descriptor of the actual start of authority record. And if we take a look down here, here's the start of authority record within the zone database itself. And this record has a serial number. It specifies the primary DNS server that's holding this particular zone, and then the responsible person for this. This would be somebody who might be in charge of managing the zone database. Okay, this isn't a big deal, but you might have configurations set up that are emailed out to hostmaster.wiredbraincoffee.com. And notice we have a dot here. This is replacing the normal sign that you'd be used to, the @ sign. Okay, this is how DNS basically will specify the IP or the email address, so no big deal there. The serial number is in reference to the change level on this actual DNS zone. So whenever I make a change to the zone, you'll see the serial number incremented by 1. And this is important because my secondary, remember down here, it's going to pay attention to this serial number and make sure that it has updated itself to be current with whatever serial number is reflected here. Okay, so if we look, this is serial number 11. If I come down here and we look, I've got serial number 14 down here. Okay, so somehow or another this serial number is actually later than this one. And what's probably happened is if we refresh this, I think we'll see that this number will jump up as well. Okay, so it's actually serial number is 14. Looking down here, we see that this secondary is current. Let's try something out. Let's add a record. Okay, and we're going to add server 4. And we'll just add this as 204. Doesn't really matter. Okay, and we're done here. If we refresh this here, we see that the record has jumped up to 15. Okay, the start of authority increment. And if we go down here to this zone, we see that it's still 14 here. However, when we refresh, it also adds this record and then jumps up and instantly has refreshed and added this record. The zone transfer has already taken place. Now, this instantaneous zone transfer is because of the setting we looked at previously. Let's disable this setting, this name server setting, actually zone transfer setting where we have the automatic notify on. Okay, so I'm turning this off and clicking OK. Now that this is off, let's add server 5 just for experimentation purposes. Okay, we'll add this host here, and we see we have server 5. This will jump up here. Now it's up to 16. And now we're going to go down to server 2. We're looking at the secondary zone of Wired Brain Coffee. And now, even when I reload this, okay, you see that I'm not getting the server 5 record right away, and this serial number is not incrementing to 16. Okay, so even if I do a reload from master, okay, now I got an error message. I'm not able to pull down that record. We'll give it a second here. Okay, basically what's happened, we made a change up here. It's going to take a second. If you just be patient when you get one of these, give it a couple seconds. Typically you'll see that it'll reload and won't be a big deal. So if we refresh this even, we'll see that momentarily it'll come back up. Okay, so we'll leave it alone for right now. While we're waiting for that to figure itself out, I want to show you another setting here. So let's go back up to the zone and the start of authority record. And now let's take a look at some of the other settings here on the start of authority. And notice this serial number that was here, 16, is changing here as well. This number is one and the same. Okay, so we get the primary server, the responsible person, and now let's talk about these other settings here. We have several different settings here. The refresh interval, this setting determines how often the secondary will query the primary server. So every 15 minutes, server 2 is going to go out to server 1 and basically want to download or transfer over server 1's zone. Okay? The retry interval is specifying if this server 1's not available. Okay, so every 15 minutes, server 2 is going to try and contact server 1. But let's say that server 1's not available at this time. How long are you going to wait before you try contacting server 2 again? Okay, and that time period here is 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to give you 10 more minutes. I'm going to check back with you again to see if I can't transfer over from you now. Let's say that this goes on and on and on and on for a period of time because maybe server 1's down or the network connection between server 2 and server 1 is down. how long until those records on server 2 are decided that they're no longer valid. Okay, and that's what this expires after setting is for. After 1 day, the secondary DNS server, what we have on server 2 now, is basically going to say that these records are no longer valid. Okay, we've waited, we've tried to transfer, we've tried to update, we've got to determine that these records are stale at this point because we're not sure, we can't verify that they're still valid. Okay, so that's what happens there. The minimum or default time to live, okay, the time to live determines how long an entry will be cached in the DNS client's client cache. And the default setting here is 1 hour. We could set this, we could change this higher. I often do on DNS servers that I configure. But this is determining, let's say that we've got an entry for www.yahoo.com in the cache here, and we provide that entry to the actual DNS client. How long will that record, how long will we tell them to cache that entry for? Okay, right now it's set at 1 hour. We could change this up to 1 day, which is what I typically do. And then what will happen is that DNS client cache entry will now be a 1 day entry instead of the 1 hour. And then this last record here is just the time to live for this particular record. It's for the start of authority record itself. Okay, so right now the default on this is set at 1 hour, no minutes, and no seconds. Okay, let's go back over here to our zone, and let's refresh it. Okay, and we see that it worked out its problem, and now when we look, we have actually got that server 5 entry over, so it took a little bit of time. Maybe that 15 minutes that we were talking about before has expired and the transfer took place. Okay, if it's in the middle of a transfer and you try to retransfer, it doesn't like that, so that could have happened as well. Okay, so verifying here once again, select up here. This record's on 16. If we come down here, this record is in line because it's got its SOA increment up to 16 as well. Okay, and then our last tab that we have to worry about here in Wins, or in the zone properties, is the Wins tab. And this isn't really used too much anymore, but you can use Wins to resolve names not found by querying the DNS namespace. Okay, so this is really important, or can be helpful if you have a very populated Wins database. If you're not using Wins, this isn't going to help you one bit. But in older companies, ones that have been relying on Microsoft technologies for quite some time, you might have quite a Wins database set up. So it might be beneficial, if DNS isn't working, why not, give it a try. We'll try out Wins here. And what you do basically here is just specify the Wins servers. Pretty low key as far as how to set it up. Not a big deal as far as it working, but it's really something that's not very commonly used right now. Okay, let's connect back over to our XP machine, and now we've gone through the installation, secondary, reverse, zone transfer settings, other settings. Let's take a look at the DNS client configuration and then some DNS recovery tips as well. Okay, so we're sitting here on our actual XP machine, and this is going to act as our DNS client. And now that we have two different DNS servers, now is when we can actually configure a preferred and an alternate DNS server. Okay, remember before when we were looking at this, I told you, if you don't have a second DNS server, there should be nothing here. You're not supposed to put your ISP's IP address here. That doesn't work. Okay, but at this point here, we can enter in 192.168.1.200. And what will happen then, if 100 goes down, for whatever reason, the server is taken offline, network's not available, we won't be able to connect to that preferred DNS server, so then we'll make a request out to the alternate DNS server. Okay, so once again, the only time we try to contact the alternate DNS server is if this server is flat out not available. Okay, we don't contact the alternate DNS server if this one just doesn't know the answer. Okay, so the only time we go here is if we flat out prefer DNS server just isn't available. It's something that's important to know when it comes time to troubleshoot DNS. Now, we've got this configured. Here's our primary server. Here's our secondary server, but it really has nothing to do with preferred and alternate. Let's go over here to our diagram here. We'll try to create some little drawing here. Let's assume that I've got another client machine here. Okay, and XP1 currently is configured. This is the preferred DNS server. Okay, and this is the alternate DNS server over here. I'm not going to draw the arrow so we avoid confusion. If we had 1,000 XP1s, okay, or 1,000 machines running XP, and they were all pointing to server 1 as the preferred DNS server, okay, server 1 would be very, very heavily loaded while server 2 is getting very little traffic. Okay, now this works okay from a fault tolerance standpoint. If server 1 goes down, well, all these will then switch over and start using server 2, okay, all 1,000 clients. But in the meantime, we're not really utilizing this server, and server 1's really, really slow because of all the requests that are going out. What you should do when you're setting up your DNS clients, if you got this situation, is instead of your machines being set up this way, you should set up one machine to point to server 1 and the next machine to point to server 2. Okay, so when I say point, this is going to be the preferred DNS server for this other XP machine. I'm just going to put an X down here on it. Okay, so the preferred DNS server will be 192.168.1.200, and the alternate DNS server for this machine will be server 1, 192.168.1.100. And the preferred DNS server for XP1 is going to be, as we have it configured, 100. Alternate will be .200. Okay, and what we can do then, if we had 1,000 machines, we could have 500 of them pointing to server 2 as its preferred DNS server, and we could have 500 more pointing to server 1 as its preferred DNS server. So what we're getting is the best of both worlds. We're getting some load balancing. Both of these servers are being utilized, and if at any point one of these servers were to fail, well then, these machines could then come over here to server 2, and, server 2 would be real busy until we replace this DNS server, but we'd have load balancing when both servers are up and fault tolerance when one of the server fails. And that's really how you want to set up your DNS clients, is to have half of them configured to use one server and half of them configured to use another server. Okay, and that can be configured also pretty easily through DHCP. Okay. Last topic we have to cover then is just a little bit of fault tolerance or disaster recovery, I guess. Let's assume that one of our servers were to fail. Okay, if server 1 fails here, it's no longer available, and we still need to make changes to server 2. Let me reiterate that and kind of clarify. Remember, server 1, the wiredbraincoffee.com zone here, this is the primary master. This is where we make changes. If this server were to go offline, the only server we have available currently would be then be server 2. But remember, this is a secondary zone. And if I come here, right-click, and try to create a new entry, I can't create a new host record. Okay, so what I can do, come up here, and let's just stop this for right now. Let's see, all tasks, update, reload. Let's go to the properties. We'll just pause it that way. Okay, so we pause this zone. And let's assume I pause it so it's not available right now. And what I can do is come down here to server 2. This is a secondary. I'm going to go to the properties of this zone. And now I'm going to change it from being a secondary up to being a primary zone. Okay? Now I do that and click OK. And all of a sudden now, if I come down here and right click, I can create host records on this machine. Okay? So I can do anything. Now all of a sudden this is a read-write copy. Okay, now the problem we're going to have, if both of these are online, okay, this zone and this zone, we're not going to be able to transfer back and forth. We can only have one primary at any given time. Okay, so that's something we have to consider. It's not that we can have two primaries, it's just if one goes down, we can make one of our secondaries a primary zone. Okay, and one big problem we would have, if we did have this situation right now, is these records would no longer be transferred back and forth to each other. If I create an entry here, let's assume that, let's just go ahead and start this zone back up. Okay, no longer will records be transferred from server 1, wiredbraincoffee.com, down to server 2, because both of these are primary. Okay, and we need a primary and then the standard secondaries for that situation to work. Another thing we can do, don't forget what this DNS database is actually named. Remember, it's wiredbraincoffee.com.dns. So if we go out and we look on this server, so we're going to My Computer, C, the system root, which is Windows by default, Windows directory. Then we go into System32, DNS directory. Okay, if we look right here, what do we have? We have that wiredbraincoffee.com.dns file. Okay, so what we're going to do is let's assume that this server went down, but we had a backup of this DNS database, either on a tape backup, or we were able to take the hard drive out of the server. So maybe we had a hardware failure, the motherboard failed or something, but we could still get the hard drive out of the server. We have this file located on the actual hard drive. What we can do from our DNS console here, we can create a forward lookup zone, new zone. We'll just call it a primary just for argument's sake right now. And let's just name it something different. Let's call it wbc.com. Okay, and remember this setting here, use this existing file. Okay, this is actually where it pulls it from, and we can't use this because we're not going to find it, but we have to use the same name. And that makes sense. There's no reason why we'd want to use a different name anyway. Okay, and that's going to pull this information from system root, Windows, system32, DNS. So I click Next, Next, Finish, and we can't do it in this case because the zone already exists. But what would happen is on this new DNS server, let's say that we set this up on server 3, we'd be able to pull that DNS database into server 3. We wouldn't have to worry about repopulating the DNS database. So it's a quick, down and dirty way to get your DNS server back online quickly in case your DNS server fails. Okay, that wraps up Lab 2. What we're going to do next, basically in Lab 3, is kind of switch gears. We're going to add some servers to our network, and we're going to get more in-depth and detailed about a real-world scenario. We're going to set up a Active Directory integrated situation, Active Directory integrated zone, a real network on the local side, and we're going to start building our public side network as well. So what will happen in Lab 3, that'll be the company network. In Lab 4, then we're going to get onto the public side, and we're going to put these two pieces together and have a fully functional DNS infrastructure by the time we finish up. So we'll see you back here real soon when we start up on Lab 3.